Thank you so much, Chairman Himes, for facilitating and calling in such wonderful witnesses, and thank you to our speaker for having the foresight and placing the value and importance in the threat that inequality poses to the stability of a prosperous American society. Dr. Furman had said something at the beginning of his testimony that I think is just so worth repeating, which is that from 1948 to 1973, the typical American family saw their income double about once every 23 years. So if you work an entire career, you can see yourself actually step up in your social class in your lifetime. You can go from an apartment to a home, to have your children go to a good school. And since 1973, the rate that it takes to double your income will now take over 100 years. So a family's income will not double in their lifetime or in one working generation, but 3 or 4 working generations, not once in one generation or once in one lifetime, but once in a century. And that declination of growth and prosperity is an absolute threat. But income inequality is not just growing. Historically, it has been accelerating. Is that true, Professor Galbraith?
With some ups and downs, yes.
And so one of my questions here is that in that acceleration, we're seeing developments, that would mean that acceleration means these developments in inequality start happening in a more concentrated period of time more recently. And I'm interested, one of the things that I'm charged with in this committee is really digging into some of the generational aspects in how inequality is manifesting today. And I'm interested if there are certain key basic building blocks to an American way of life, whether it's education, the home you live in, the water that you're drinking, the way your community is organized. If there are certain of those emerging challenges, what is much harder now that was perhaps easier for the American family to do about 50 years ago that we should really be examining as a committee?
Well, I think many of the things you're mentioning will not factor into income specifically, but into the quality of life that our communities are able to experience. And that was something, a major project of construction in the 20th century. It got us Social Security. It got us essentially upgraded. It got us housing that was upgraded that people could live in. It got us an educational system that was broadly accessible to the population. All of these things add in to the general quality of life. When you've taken care of those, and then you'll moderate the growth of earnings. You're not going to prevent accumulations. You're not going to prevent some people from getting rich. You wouldn't want to. But you can, of course, work to prevent them from passing it on. Encourage philanthropy and basically tax estates. And then you ensure that you're kind of renewing the republic at each generation. That's the way I tend to think about it. The rise of inequality is a specific historical period. It starts in the late 1970s. It really it reaches a peak around 2000. After that, it's a series of ups and downs in my measures. We're still at a very, very high level. But it wasn't always like that, and it doesn't have to be like that. And there's living memory of how it can be moderated and brought back into essentially a sustainable community.
Thank you.
I just want to jump in with one word: education.
Thank you, Professor Curie. And to follow up on that, I think one of the things that I'm so appreciative about the disposition of this committee is that it is investigatory, and we're not coming to the table, trying to prove a predetermined point, but truly investigate what are some of the areas that are most effective to narrow in on. And so as a general question to the overall committee, if you were to determine what success would look like for this committee, what we can walk away from in terms of what we investigate or what measures we could perhaps determine, suggestions, what would that look like to you in terms of what would be a successful endeavor within the scope of this committee?
Hi, this is Joy. I will weigh in for the National Urban League. I would love to see you all really invest in where we're putting our investments around minority-owned businesses, allowing people to invest in themselves and in their communities, to hire, to grow from being solo proprietors, maybe only having one employee, to having multiple employees, to be able to benefit from all the infrastructure investments that we are having. That would happen regionally, to Congresswoman Craig's point, and others, and that would have regional impact, and that would have generational impact, because young people are overwhelmingly entrepreneurial, but they also do not have access to capital. And so I'd love to see the committee really do an assessment of what is happening with minority-owned firms and how we can invest in them.
Barnes, you had mentioned something earlier that I wanted to make sure we revisited, which was how we measure poverty in the United States. You know, this is a measure that is almost notoriously been obsolete. The original calculation of the poverty line in the United States is essentially 3 times whatever the cost of the basic nutritional requirement was in 1963. And that is then adjusted for family size and slightly for inflation, but we are largely rooted and anchored in that original calculation. 1963, that assumes largely one breadwinner in the home. It assumes no cost of childcare. It was before many of the common utilities, what we consider utilities now, like the internet, even existed. And so my question to you is, we cannot fix what we cannot measure. We cannot know if we are being successful or not with such obsolete measures. So what, if you could calculate a poverty line today, what would be some of those key inputs, and how would you determine what do you think should go into a modern measure of a poverty line?
Thank you for this question. What should go into the poverty line would include some of the costs of living that have outpaced the cost of income over the past 60 years. So this is the cost of healthcare, the cost of housing, the cost of education, of childcare, of transportation, of basic utilities. I would also include in some way to account for the debt burdens that households are facing unequally across race, of course. And so all of these factors are currently inadequately included in the measure of poverty. And what that does is, as you've said, and I would rely on the wisdom of Reverend Dr. King, as he was organizing the Poor People's Campaign in 1968, he said the prescription for the cure rests with an accurate diagnosis of the disease. And unless we understand these conditions, unless we have this full picture, there's no way that we are going to be able to actually repair the deep breaches in our society.
Thank you. And going further on that, we cannot fix what we cannot measure. So I pose this question to all of our witnesses. Are there existing measures? Are there new measures that we should be determining? Are there current measures that are obsolete, like the poverty line, that the federal government should be examining and updating? And are there measures that we currently have that are being underlooked in our determination of success? You know, just as Bobby Kennedy said decades ago, this is not just about GDP, but actual well-being. Professor Curry.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in here. I serve on the Committee on National Statistics for the National Academy of Sciences, and they have a committee that's looking into better measures of poverty right now. The supplemental poverty measure that the census already puts out is a much better measure because it does include things like housing. It does not include the value of medical care, which is a big problem, and so there's quite a lot of discussion about how that could be appropriately incorporated. So I would say take a look at the supplemental poverty measure instead of the traditional poverty measure. I mean, one problem with the traditional poverty measure is it doesn't include the value of any federal programs. So by definition, none of the federal programs for poor people can have any effect on poverty because they're not included in the poverty measure, right?
Thank you, Professor.
Exactly what I was going to say. You want to document the extent of the problem. You also want to understand how your programs are helping to solve the problem. And so if you look at a poverty measure that doesn't include SNAP benefits, that doesn't include the earned income tax credit, you'll miss out on what you're doing to actually lower it, for example, in the rescue plan and the CARES Act. and what that was reflected in the New York Times story.
Thank you.